My wife Molly has recently shared a show with me called Kevin Can F Himself. This interesting show that has this dual concept. It's in a way when Kevin, the husband, is the focal point, it's sort of this laughing, bombastic sitcom. And when she's the focus, it suddenly turns into a Netflix crime drama documentary show. And so it's an interesting stark contrast to easily help the viewer sort of shift perspective as to what's going on. And for him, he is very much like, the big, bubbly, laughable 80s sitcom dad in a lot of ways. And when she is out doing her stuff in the world, she's plotting to take him out, to find her way out of the situation she's in, and highlighting stuff that goes on behind, when the cameras are off, and suddenly starting to realize the subtleness of his character. And in a way, it starts to slowly reveal the subtleness of her character. And it's all very interesting, related to the past few episodes that I've done, related to this sort of victim narcissist dichotomy. And I think it's all centered around the drama triangle. You've got the persecutor, the rescuer, and the victim. And it's still just playing with these other areas, right? The helper or the rescuer is usually having to identify someone that is lesser of need, or create a situation in which someone is in lesser of need to make myself feel good. The persecutor is usually putting people down. This tends to be labeled as the narcissist. And in a lot of ways, the victim is also someone that can have narcissistic tendencies, but is maybe exploiting the idea of being a victim to put all of the focus attention on themselves. And so the drama triangle is this codependency cycle. And usually many people get sort of wrapped up in some sort of a cycle when they're dealing with domestic abuse or with some sort of interpersonal challenge where they're just wrapped up in something or wrapped up in someone. And so the movement from the codependency of the drama triangle is to go into the empowerment dynamic, which is the victim becomes the creator, the persecutor becomes the challenger, and the rescuer becomes the coach. And it's this healthy impersonalness. There are boundaries, there's this separation. And in a lot of ways, codependency is, well, my favorite definition of codependency is I won't call you out on your shit if you don't call me out on mine. So there's usually a lot of drama in the sense that there's covert conversations, not typically any direct conflict. And so when you are dealing with enmeshment it's not just single persons, right? It can be groups or communities where there's this enmeshment where everything you do impacts me and my sense of well-being. Everything that I do impacts you and your sense of well-being. And so the way through from drama to empowerment is usually setting some sort of boundaries and developing towards a respect for individuals, right? And compassion. I see the algorithm in my mind for respect is that respect equals boundaries plus admiration. And admiration is just seeing the positive qualities in somebody. Everybody has them. They have some sort of skill, they have some sort of ability or attractiveness or a calmness or an assertiveness or something that can be appreciated. And then the boundaries part is usually where a lot of people really struggle. When someone has admiration without boundaries, it produces envy. It means you put yourself above or below that person, usually below. And when you just have boundaries and no admiration, that usually creates separation or some sort of hate, typically. And so boundaries has its own recipe of to set an effective boundary is to, first of all, communicate it. You have to communicate and have direct expression of what the boundary and expectation is. You set the expectation. And then if the person violates that expectation, there's a consequence. Now, if any point you miss any of those components, there are consequences. If you don't follow up on a consequence, then someone simply believes that the boundary doesn't exist and they just will keep doing what they want to do. If they get only the consequence and they're not clearly communicated what the boundary is or what the expectation is, then usually they can tout some sort of unfairness. Like, that's unfair that you're suddenly changing your mind. You're suddenly setting a boundary with me and you didn't tell me what the expectation was. You didn't give me an opportunity to actually hold the boundary. So that's like where some of the ingredients can get a little messed up. So if you have all of those in place, then you can actually follow through with setting a boundary and allow for a separateness of self. And it is important to have the separateness of self. It can be really tricky in spiritual circles or really tricky in sort of new age understandings, because the idea is, with tapping into spiritual essence, you're tapping into the soul. And when you tap into the soul, there is this sense of oneness and wholeness and interconnectedness. That's kind of the feeling or the idea. But that can get misinterpreted as, I am psychologically and physically enmeshed with everybody. That's not the same thing. Enmeshment is not the same thing as spiritual wholeness and essence. In a way, what I'm talking about when it comes to having admiration for somebody and compassion for somebody is that despite their flaws, there's something that you can appreciate about them. That, in a way, is the connection to oneness and wholeness. That is a way of seeing that somebody is someone you could appreciate, and at its core, at its essence of who we are as, pure light, or however you want to describe it, as a spirit or soul. There's a certain purity to all of us, not an innocence necessarily, but um, there's a certain intangible innocence. I guess I will use that word. And what ends up messing us up a lot is, again, that enmeshment. So you start to get into this like place where maybe the boundaries start to blur in physical spaces. Maybe you're spending a lot of time with people when you need to have your own things that you need to do. Maybe there are emotional boundaries that are being missed. Now suddenly you feel like it should be okay for you to be emotionally open with every single person you meet, to air your traumas at them, or to publicly cry in situations where, maybe that's not appropriate or healthy to do, or to trauma dump or anything like that, and not realize the impact you have on the other person because they're supposed to be feeling what you're feeling. Or intellectual boundaries, like where you're just data dumping. I've done this plenty of times where you feel like, well, if we're all the same, then we need to understand the same things, or we need to believe the same things. So you're just throwing a lot of information at somebody that doesn't necessarily want it. And then social boundaries. Again, it's like spending a lot of time with each other, but it is like maybe reinforcing that we all need to have the same beliefs, or we need to all abide by the same rules. And that's violating individuality. So it is this paradox of feeling like, in order to actually feel connected to people and admire them and appreciate them, and to have proper boundaries, so that I can actually see you as a separate being and appreciate you, and then also see the relating essence within each other. It's not looking at you as an object to absorb into me, or that I absorb into you. It's that we are both subjects, that we interconnect and we talk. So it's an interconnectedness, not not an enmeshment. And that move from the drama triangle to the empowerment dynamic is that setting of boundaries, so that you move from being a victim to now being a creator. Like, oh, I can take charge of my life. I can actually leave my partner. I can move. I can get a job. I can do the things that I need to do to get out of the situation I'm in, if I truly want to get out of the situation I'm in, by acknowledging what I want, by acknowledging my own abilities, by acknowledging my own intellect or skills or social circle or emotional state or background or any of that. And then be able to take charge and start to make new choices and move towards a better life. The same with the challenger, moving from a victim or villain place of perhaps being perceived as a narcissist, or actually having been, in a diagnostic way, and moving into a place where you have the ability to know what buttons push gets, which buttons to push that get people kind of riled up, right? And in a way, the enmeshment part is to push their buttons so that you can feel superior. But if you're a challenger, now you have the skills to actually help them grow, to support them. You're like, these are the obstacles that are actually going to allow you to do the work to improve yourself. And it's the same with a coach. A coach is just does it more in a cheerleader kind of way or in an accountability kind of way. And the same thing here is like your sense of progress or your sense of self or what you're doing next has nothing to do with my sense of self. The rescuer usually has a stake in whether or not the person they're trying to help actually improves. And because they don't feel like the person that they're helping is actually self-sufficient, able to help themselves in some sort of way. They treat them like a victim, or the person is being a victim and therefore is like almost asking for it. And so in a way, creating this in impersonalness allows for the ability for someone to see a person for a sovereign human being that they are, and then they get to operate by their own means and do their own thing. And I think that's incredibly powerful for anyone to try to work towards and get to. And now it's incredibly challenging to get towards that place if we have wounding in childhood, complex trauma, where our dependency is all sorts of skewed, where our relationship to getting attention and affection is not being supported properly. That if we have, for example, a narcissistic parent, someone who is so incredibly self-focused, and all the kid wants is attention from their parent, and they can't get that attention because their parent has too much of their own trauma that's making them so self-focused, then it puts a damper on the child's development and they don't feel connected to their family. They don't feel like who they are as an authentic person is being honored and admired. So the child has to adapt to the parent and, in a way, become like the parent. So they end up perpetuating or becoming a narcissist themselves in maybe a slightly different style, or they end up trying to eventually rebel against the family and then try to find a sense of belonging somewhere else. But they don't find that belonging in that friend group either, because there also is something within the self that feels a sense of shame from not being accepted by the family. So anywhere they try to be accepted, there's no allowance for acceptance. I'm getting all of this from Tim Fletcher's work, by the way. I did not personally um, discover all of this by any means. I'm almost just organizing and sharing all of this in my mind in the way that makes sense to me, combining a couple different frameworks. So I do recommend going to Tim Fletcher's work to get some of that support. I can usually help with the data and sort of the understanding or asking questions. And I do that through coaching, which you can look at on my Substack, dopamine.substack.com. Or if you just go to substack.com/let's go C note, you can see all of my publications and get in touch with me that way if you're interested to dive more into some of these other components like personality types, the drama triangle, and how that relates to my story, and then unraveling and asking questions for how that relates to you. So that's one of my strengths, is asking questions and getting to the nitty gritty. And then if you need further support from a therapist, from trauma healing, or someone like that who is like a Tim Fletcher in the world, then I can usually direct you in that direction. I am not a trauma coach or any of that stuff. So I just, for ethical sake, I need to be clear about that. So the movement from a child, I'm thinking about the developmental aspect of a child. And I reference also Kim Barta, who's really great for shadow work. And by shadow work, it's usually this movement out of what we've repressed, or what we continue to do to make us interdependent into this enmeshment, and not allow for us to individuate, to be our authentic selves. And many of us who have had complex trauma are afraid of being our authentic selves, that we're going to be rejected. We're going to be rejected by our partner, our parents, by jobs. No matter what we do, if someone gets a glimpse of the real us, that we're going to immediately get rejected or fired or something like that. And so at its core, rejection and abandonment is the fear because that's what we felt. And or that's what we were starting to feel, but we didn't have the safety to actually feel that. So we recognized or registered that rejection and abandonment was happening in a way. I mean, when you're kids, you don't have the subtle awareness to be actually see that. When you think of emotions as a kid, it's like happy, sad, scared, right? But something like being rejected or abandoned, those are much more subtle emotions that, okay, we're not equipped to deal with that. So we just need to adapt for survival and, in a way, isolate and conceptually and psychologically isolate to adapt to our situation. So we become maybe like the parent that's the more dangerous one in order to in order to feel like we camouflage effectively. And so the same thing happens with cultures that we grew up through and into. And as we get to a later stage of our development in our life, we might be unraveling our relationship to cultures. And it could be an easy thing and it could be a complex thing. For some people, it's just like my relationship to the church or my relationship to the country. And then I go to a different country and I see what the world's like over there. And cool, I found myself. For other people, it's similar to my situation where it's complex trauma and you have to go through almost the varying stages of development that you've been through and recognize how you've been inauthentic at each of those stages. It's been a harrowing ordeal. And, I talk about those stages, or I talked about the stages in the stages model on the Developmental Digest, which is another Substack that I have. But I do think at some point I'll probably go through the stages here relative to complex trauma, because I think it is really interesting. I think stages of development are fascinating in the sense that someone like Carl Jung didn't get to that work. He had an inkling that there was that idea, but he just didn't get there. And there was not enough external research done yet to show that. That didn't happen until Claire Graves and Abraham Maslow and kind of mid 20th century, where that was starting to unfold. And then that's been further perpetuated by Ken Wilber and people who are doing developmental psychology work. So I like to reference Kim Barta and Terry O'Fallon's The Stages model quite a bit because I think it's incredibly powerful to go through these different perspectives. They talk about concrete awareness and subtle awareness, and then meta-aware, which is awareness of awareness. The concrete awareness is just seeing and perceiving reality and interfacing with reality directly. That there's no difference between what's going on psychologically and subtly and what's going on in reality. So everything is sort of enmeshed and happening at the same time. If you think you see a ghost, that is a ghost, right? It doesn't matter your personality type or anything like that. It's strictly developmental. If you have an imaginary friend, it's not imaginary. It's imaginary to the adults. To you, it's real. And that's why, you hear these stories of kids might overhear a ghost story and then they develop an imaginary friend and they start talking to that person and the parents are like, they're just talking to somebody and I don't understand it. It might be the same way with animals. Like they might have some sort of hallucination or they might have some sort of some blending of their visual imagination and their actual vision, and it gets conflated for the difference between what they see in reality and what is actually happening in their mind. So there's no difference between their mind and the external world, if that makes sense. And then subtle awareness is starting to fillet that out and starting to separate that. You get like ghost hunting and you're like, okay, ghosts are separate from us. So I'm going to go look for them and I'm going to try to understand what that is, maybe on a scientific level, or try to break it down practically. Like, oh, this is an EMF thing. This is the electromagnetic field in this house is massive and it's causing hallucinations, right? And the fact that you can say that there's a hallucination means that it's separating a state of normalness, a state of perceiving from a sort of tainted or distorted sense of self. And in a way, understanding subtle awareness, getting into psychology, getting into cultures and things like that, is starting to see how we have distortions in our awareness. And so in a way, we start to also explore physical reality, chemicals, and we understand how chemicals affect us and affect our body, and exploring distant worlds and chemical gases and all of these things that are impacting our reality and impacting us, that have a subtle influence on the way that we perceive reality. Sometimes that is also a part of like deconstructing a religion or deconstructing our relationship to culture, like I said. So it's a whole thing. And, just knowing those two, I think, is incredibly powerful. This difference between concrete and subtle. And then if we have like this concrete awareness when we're young, another aspect of the stages model is first, second, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth person perspective. And there's 1.0, 1.5 perspective. So first person perspective is like there's a receptive and then there's an active version of each. 2.0 is reciprocity, 2.5 is interpenetrative. So it's just a greater sense of active. I kind of think of them as like the levels in high school. You've got freshman, sophomore, junior, senior. And those four first stages, 1.0, 1.5, 2.0, 2.5, are, the first tier. That's the concrete tier. And then you get the third person, 3.5, fourth person, 4.5. That's the subtle tier of perspective. And so much of complex trauma, I think, happens in the early 1.0 and 1.5 stages. What ultimately I believe happens is, this is referenced from Kim Barta. There's a 7 articles. You just search for like Kim Barta, Barta, 7 articles, and 7 articles of the stages model or something like that. It's this massive PDF. It's really incredibly helpful. And he talks about that, how someone who could have an ego split, he talks about 3 types of shadow. He talks about projections, introjections, and split ego states. So projections are when you are taking something that's happening within you and casting it outward. So it's like, I don't have a sense of, I don't know what it's unconscious agency. So I don't see what I'm doing or how or why I'm doing it. Introjection is unconscious receptivity. And so I don't know what I'm taking in and I don't understand how it's affecting me. Like I just am blind to that. And then split ego states are when at some point in your development, there had to be a split or there had to be a change in your development. So when you go through each of the stages, when you go from first person perspective to second person perspective, that first person is you. It's me. It's my I amness. It's your ego. And ego development is important. The ego is not bad. We do not destroy the ego. We do not kill the ego. That is nonsense. That's still the ego putting itself at the core of attention by telling you to kill it. But the ego is very practical. I have a laptop. I have a phone. I'm holding my microphone. I have things. And it's very practical to have those things and protect those things. But it is not the leading edge of development. And when someone has a split, they may either repress a part of their development at one point, or they may overly own it. And so at some point, you could take that early first person I amness, that ego, that taker, that needs to take because they weren't really honored as an individual. They don't believe that their I amness is strong enough, that they need it to be stronger. They're going to make that the leading edge throughout their development. And it's going to develop skills. It's going to become stronger. And so it develops more tools for manipulation. And that gets into like some of the narcissist stuff, because that's what a narcissist will ultimately do, is manipulate the world around you to get a leg up and to create a belief, to create a grandiosity, to perpetuate a feeling or a psychological sense that I am better than everybody else. And so there's 3 different types of narcissism that I got from this really great Tim Fletcher video. The video is called When a Narcissist is Triggered, Others Pay the Price. But it goes into this really great detail about narcissistic triggers and the types of narcissists. So I'm going to read this section about the types of narcissist. I had ChatGPT break it down. The exhibitionist narcissist is boastful and openly self-centered, putting others down to elevate themselves. So in that show that I started the podcast with, uh, it talks about this. This is Kevin. Kevin is the boastful and openly self-centered, putting others down by elevating themselves type of person. The other type is the toxic narcissist that thrives on causing pain and chaos and enjoying the distress they create. And it's a little more of the obvious villain, someone that's just like clearly looking down at people, creating victims, and causing a problem at every turn. And then the covert narcissist appears humble or self sacrificing, but is still seeking validation by making everything about them. It's the type of person that's like, oh, no one could ever love me. And then someone's like, oh, we love you. You're a really great guy. Blah, blah, blah. But like, they just keep piling it on as like, nah, I'm not great. And, just keep doing that. I've had a little bit of that. I've been a little chaotic at times and certainly boastful and openly self-centered at times. So I don't know that this is a situation where there's like one type that you ultimately remain, but it can show up in all sorts of different ways. I'm moving around a little bit because I need to plug in my laptop. And so, what's interesting about the narcissist relative to all of this, I have to close my window as well. So, loud noise. All right, there you go. So obviously, like, there's two things here. There's the narcissist. I'm going to go slower because this stuff affects me because I'm working through it. And it's really interesting to get to a place of starting to explore, like, oh, I think I've been narcissistic. And to not use that as ammo for further shame. I can feel the tendency within me to use that as an ammo for further shame. Because ultimately, the narcissist is reacting to avoiding shame. It's either avoiding shame or emulating a parent who is avoiding shame. So it may be both. It could be introjecting your parents' shame and then making that your shame and then sort of compounding that. Or it's having had developed shame because you couldn't fit in with your family or you couldn't fit in with your friends and maybe still don't feel like you fit in with your family, with your current partnership, or whatever the situation may be for you right now. And I think, what's interesting about this Kevin Can F Himself show is that it's kind of highlighting this tendency in culture or this trend that it feels like, men are typically touted as or do experience some version of this narcissist role. And women tend to take on more of the victim role. So in the show, it's like Kevin is representing the bumbly 80s dad that is just reacting to being trapped in, conventional life and trapped in the, I've got a wife and she's an idiot and all of this stuff. And my friends are bumbling idiots, but they're okay. And we sort of, it's like the 80s dad trope of being the bumbling idiot. And then the and then like the lead female in the show, the wife, which I feel awful. I don't even remember her name. Allison, I think. No. Yes, Allison, I think her name is. That's a little funny that I don't remember her name. I've only watched 3 episodes, maybe 4. Anyway, doesn't matter. I don't need to defend myself there. But tend to have more of a victim relationship. And it's shown through her really putting a lot of work in to find this covert way to get out of the situation and basically say that, something else needs to happen. Someone needs to come save me, or someone needs to, effectively someone needs to save me or help me through this, or, there needs to be some sort of subtle way to get out of this that isn't my doing, that isn't going to get my hands dirty, that isn't going to involve me being assertive and asserting myself and stepping forward. And so it's just kind of highlighting this trend or tendency for men to be labeled as the narcissist or have it as a pathology, or for women to have this victim stance or this pathology. I don't think having a victim stance is necessarily seen as a pathology, which I think is really interesting also. Um, so in a way, when I'm talking about the narcissist, I know that there are probably men like me that listen to this sort of thing, or they have a knee jerk reaction to a lot of women in the zeitgeist sort of talking about men generally as narcissists. And I think this is more drama triangle stuff that's happening. With the increased political divide, it's pretty clear that a lot more men are becoming conservative and a lot more women are becoming liberal, and they're sorting as they get younger. It's really fascinating to see this sorting happening, and further perpetuating this narrative, and often, and in a way that's understanding. Like, people talk about the narcissist as like, avoid that at all costs, dodge that, dodge that, dodge that. And Tim Fletcher is the only one that I've seen so far that is actually offering help to someone that is at a point where they can see that they have these narcissistic tendencies and want to improve them. So far, it's always vilifying, right? And that's interesting. It's interesting to see that the villain in the drama triangle also needs help. They also are deserving of compassion. And at the same time, the people who are trying to set boundaries and trying to identify when someone is a narcissist is also very valid to do, particularly for women who have been victims of these men who have perpetually created a this situation where they're very mentally slippery. And like I said, as they go through their development, they only increase their ability to manipulate, because they're so focused on manipulating, they get very good at it. And I would admit that I've become that too, that at various points, that I've become very good at manipulating. And so the challenge too is with the compassion side of things. Compassion for the victim who is struggling makes a lot more obvious sense, and the compassion for the narcissist who is struggling, who is triggered and reacts terribly to being triggered. So, the narcissist, I'm just going to read from a note here. The narcissist often seems healthy on the surface, but their true nature is revealed when triggered. These triggers, such as rejection, lack of attention, or threats to their self image, lead them to lash out, becoming cruel and manipulative. Narcissists use manipulation to meet their needs, often without realizing it. At the core of this behavior is deep shame, an unacknowledged belief that if people knew who they really were, they would be unlovable. This shame drives their need to control and manipulate relationships. Again, it's like the belief that I'm not lovable, or there's no such thing as unconditional love, or that somebody will leave me if they get to know who I really am. And that's not the narcissistic side. The narcissistic manipulator person is not who they really are, and that's why I think there is a compassion here that is deserving. Like, the narcissist reaction is a trigger, it is a trauma response. So I think it's very important to know that. And having compassion is not the same as enabling. And the same thing with validation. It's been bugging me lately too, that when people want validation for their emotions, sometimes they just want to be enabled in their emotions. They want to remain in their limbic system, when that might not be the most helpful thing for them to do, to stay into. And so some people believe that there's this like almost toxic loyalty, that if you just validate my feelings, or you tell me I'm the best person ever, or that I'm actually better than I think I am, you know, that 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 you're being a good friend. When often being a good friend is challenging someone. That's again the empowerment dynamic. Challenging them or coaching them, holding them accountable. Not today's version of holding people accountable by being like kind of social police, but holding someone accountable by saying like, no, I actually believe you're better than this, in a healthy way. And I want to see you succeed. But if you don't change, I'm going to leave, right? I'm not going to overly invest in you. I'm just going to set a boundary, and I'm going to keep going through my life. If you refuse to grow, then I have to make a decision about myself, that kind of thing. Extreme control and jealousy. Narcissists can't tolerate others taking attention away from them. In relationships, this leads to jealousy and control issues, where they isolate their partners from others and demand constant attention. And then the compassion for the narcissist trauma's role. Narcissism is often born from severe childhood trauma, particularly from growing up in an environment where a parent was abusive or a narcissist themselves. This creates a survival response where the child develops narcissistic tendencies to cope. You have to develop the ability to manipulate in order to get what you want, because you believe that being yourself is not going to get you what you want, because frankly it didn't. So trying it again later in life is going to be harder to do because you've developed the skills, or you've developed a belief that getting what you want only happens one way, and then getting what you need in the way of just being you is completely foreign, and it's scary. And at some point you could even lose touch with, like, what does it even mean to be me, like, outside of manipulating and trusting and learning how to trust and seeking toxic loyalty and stuff like that. What does that even mean? I could probably do a whole episode talking more about the toxic loyalty thing, and enabling. And so I think it is important. I want to reiterate again, I think it's really interesting, this enabling thing, because I think compassion for the narcissist is important. And now compassion, again, doesn't mean enabling. Compassion just means, oh, there's something underneath what's going on here. And I can understand and see that you've got a lot of work to do. Now, I don't need to let that work affect me. And sometimes it's very loving to create that boundary to separate. Often it is. And so to create that separation is just quite possibly what is needed to enable them to grow, and for me to not become an actual victim of someone who is acting unconsciously or who is perpetuating this behavior. And on the other side, I think the victim side is usually asking for a lot of emotional validation because they want to be validated as the victim, and they want to be enabled as a victim of their circumstance. Either a circumstance or some belief that they have, a perpetual victim of men, of maybe lumping narcissists as men, so they don't have enough of a relationship with men in a healthy way to know that not all men are narcissists, and the same thing with men, that not all women are victims. And it's not even gender exclusive, but that's the trend, or that tends to be the case. But I don't think this is gender exclusive, just for the sake of saying it out loud. And then the speaker in the video, Tim Fletcher, emphasizes that while narcissists cause significant harm, it's essential to understand that their behavior stems from unresolved trauma and pain. So compassion for their background helps contextualize why they behave as they do without excusing the damage they cause. So that's important. It's, again, compassion, knowing that something happened and there's a reason why, but it's not an excuse. It's the same for anybody that's going through some sort of trauma and healing. It's like, I always like to say, reasons versus excuses. Understanding the reason for something is not the same reason for you to enable the behaviors that you're continuing to perpetuate, that keep you within the drama triangle, that keep you in the rescuer, perpetrator, or victim roles. But now it's like, yeah, those things happened, and you need to unravel those, or there might be permission to go slower through certain life goals, or taking your time to try to slowly move forward, but you're still moving forward, and it's still your life responsibility to make a change, to seek help, to get support, to find healthy people around you. And I think one thing that's really stuck out to me too is that triggers are not just something that happens occasionally for some people. Sometimes you're so inundated by triggers, that's what's keeping you so unconscious. It's what's keeping you unable to rest. So you have to develop this ability to. There's some people outside my window talking really loudly, so if you hear that, I apologize. I'm going to close the window, actually. Okay, they're literally talking outside my window. And that doesn't always happen. I got to remember where I was at. I was talking about triggers. Yes, I was talking about triggers in the environment. And it might be one thing, like some people say that when you're doing something like shadow work and you're trying to understand the depth of your experience, that you need to pursue triggers. And sometimes maybe you need to find or not run away from them, right? Often we're spending a lot of energy trying to avoid a triggering situation, where it also may be the other direction. It may be that you're so inundated in a triggering life and environment and situation that you need to pull back. You maybe need to pull back from listening to music that has so self-deprecating uh, lyrics or minor notes so much, um, or anything that is like movies that have dark and heavy themes. Like, you may not realize your sensitivity to those things. You may not. That's the introjection part, is like you don't realize what you're taking in and how it affects you. And so it may be worth paying attention to all of the things you just sort of do throughout the day, or the entertainment you take in, particularly when we watch like very violent TV shows. I started watching The Boys a few weeks ago, and I can see why people really think that show is interesting, but it's so inundated with heavy topics and triggering things, that potentially for so many people, that it just became overwhelming. And it was violent, and uh, the main character of Homelander is very much like the bombastic narcissist, almost like the caricature of what people see as a narcissist. That it was just too much for me to take in personally, and I needed to back off. And the nervous system can't relax if you're constantly inundated by stuff that's triggering, by, again, media, entertainment, or people in your life that maybe you need to pull away from, people that you're working with, or again, like social media. I see, perhaps also because I'm attuned to this right now, that I'm seeing it everywhere. So I need to pull back from just sort of the general zeitgeist. I'm trying to not spend as much time on Twitter slash X or on social platform. Like, I'm spending more time unfollowing people. I had to unfollow Elon Musk because he was starting to get um, way more whiny about so many of the problems that he has, that it was just like constantly frustrating. And I think it's ultimately been helpful for me to recognize these, particularly in men, to notice that these behaviors are triggering to me, and that it's something I need to notice. But at the same time, to be constantly triggered means that I'm kind of going too fast, and I need to slow down, and I need to rest, and I need the opportunity to introspect properly, and to be able to feel the difference between what it's like to be constantly triggered and inundated versus what it's like to actually feel rest and to be myself. And in a lot of ways too, it's paying attention to who you're emulating, because if you are relating to this idea of having been a narcissist or these narcissistic tendencies, number one, don't use it as a thing to perpetually shame yourself. Like, the shame has already been a problem. Don't make it more of a problem. And then to notice that part of what happened growing up is possibly having had to emulate someone who was perpetuating narcissistic tendencies, constantly putting yourself at the center of attention, or putting themselves at the center of attention. So you learn to emulate putting yourself constantly at the center of attention, or emulating their behaviors, which created that, even if that's not what you're consciously trying to do. So it's just noticing. It's always an act of noticing first. Uh, Richard Rudd in the Gene Keys talks about contemplation as a threefold act. It's awareness, then it's meditation, and then that equals ultimately contemplation. So awareness is just being aware. And so being aware might mean starting to make the adjustments, starting to say, like, oh, okay, this is everywhere. And I noticed that maybe I was emulating Elon Musk. And unfortunately, I know there are a lot of men who are emulating Elon Musk because he is successful in their eyes. And he's got so many great qualities in terms of his innovation and his ability to just his intelligence to create so many things. And some people celebrate his boldness and his willingness to challenge authority and stuff like that. But there is also in there some of those narcissistic tendencies to then selectively make themselves the victim in a very specific circumstance. Jordan Peterson is one that has also triggered me very often. I think it's because of this uh, same idea of what I've sort of felt within this specialness. I keep talking about victim and narcissism separately, but it is kind of this specialness that I've talked about. There's something about it, like, I know I'm special. I'm a special boy. And Jordan Peterson very much represents that. And unfortunately, he has a lot of young men looking to him as a father surrogate. Um, because either they remind them of their father or they remind them of the father they wish they wanted or had. And it's creating an emulation of someone who, again, gets very aggressively triggered and angry and has a lot of rage underneath that I think is really messing a lot of young men up. So it's really paying attention to who you're admiring, who you're taking in. And it's if it's from this first person perspective place, it's probably going to be paying attention to introjection. What am I taking in and how is it affecting me? And so it's then making changes. Once you start to make an awareness, then you meditate on it, and then contemplation, and being able to say, like, okay, well, now I need to make some changes. I need to be aware that, like, this person's impacting me in this way, and they're not actually growing out of this. So I need to move on and find some help. I think Tim Fletcher is a great way to do it. Crappy Childhood Fairy is wonderful. She tends to talk to women more, but I think it's I don't think it matters all that much. What you need is what you need, and I think in my case, um, I'm going to continue to pursue trying to work with Tim Fletcher, and I'm still unraveling all of this. It's a lot to take in. It's serendipitous that this show is coming forward that Molly's been watching and relates to both of our lives in various ways, and in some ways also starting to unravel for both of us personally, like these sort of default relationships to the male role or the female role, and getting away from uh, get away from just being that to just fit in some way, shape, or form, but learning to be more authentic and being more ourselves. I still have questions of what that means. Like, what does it really mean to be authentic? It could be noticing. I think Tim talks about this too. It's like noticing what is your go-to thing to try to get attention. What is your almost your persona when you're manipulating? And now manipulating might not be, again, like that you're trying to, you know, you're trying to convince someone of something. Manipulating could be just putting on a persona. It could be, for me, I identify it as the almost like this Jack Black persona. I'll get very big and bombastic in person, and I'm trying to get people to like me. I'm trying to make jokes. I'm trying to be loud. I'm trying to be zany, and I'm starting to see how often that actually backfires, and it doesn't feel authentic. I'm funny, but I'm a different kind of funny. I'm usually more artfully funny, you know. And when I am able to bring a much more sensitive side, which I think is ultimately what, for men in particular, for the narcissistic side, to release is to get to know the sensitive side. It's the loving side. Because I think that what we tried to do when we were kids is we tried to love our parents, and we tried to love on them by being connected to source, the universe, or God, and bring that innocent essence forward and say, the sort of cliche of the baby that's like, I love you, mommy. And you just like really say it with your full heart and soul. And at some point that just goes away because you had to maybe become a hard-edged person to like please your father who called you a pussy every time you cried, or or your mom was cruel to you in the same kind of way and just told you to stop being so sensitive, or they didn't accept your love, they didn't accept compliments, they didn't truly believe that they were lovable because they had their own narcissistic complex to deal with. And so I think at some point this is so incredibly valuable and important to pay attention to, because this is a passing of the torch thing. If the parent isn't healed, then the child feels it, and then they become that, and then they pass it on. And so this is a temporal virus in a way that continues to perpetuate lineages and families. When people talk about generational trauma, I think ultimately this is kind of it, right? And at some point, the buck has to stop somewhere. It might as well be with you. It might as well be with me, right? I'm working on it with my stepson, who I believe is starting to exhibit some of this too, um, and paying attention to him. And I'm working with him, and I'm not letting him spiral, and I'm also not letting him. I'm showing him love, and then I'm also not letting him create this false grandiosity. Like, he needs to earn his way to get the things that he wants out of life. That if he eventually wants a girlfriend or a partner or wife or whoever he tends to go towards, that he's got to earn that by becoming a better version of himself. That's why I keep talking about this difference between specialness versus uniqueness. This specialness is almost like this ordained, self aggrandizing thing. And it could be self aggrandizing again by making yourself less or better than somebody else. But ultimately, it's a false sense of self. It's not a modest assessment of who you are and what you bring to the table. It's instead of saying, I'm probably not very good at that, or I'm not interested in that, you say, like, yeah, I could do that. I could do it well. And you try to convince everyone around you that you could do it well. And it becomes this psychological game of making sure that everyone believes that you're the shit instead of actually becoming the shit, or getting into a situation in which you naturally are, where you have the skills or the desire to do that, and really attune to your uniqueness, your unique personality type, the unique ways in which you learn and make decisions, or the unique developmental path that you've been on, or your unique story, or something related to your lineage, or even just accepting that, like, I'm a 5'4" chubby male, 38 years old. I'm not going to be a linebacker in the NFL. That's actually not me being less than. That's just my unique circumstance and my unique story. So uniqueness is a little more neutral, frankly. And specialness is this forced specialness, this forced better or worseness than you actually are. I guess the last thing I can probably wrap up with here is really feeling like, I guess if there's a practical thing I can give away here, it's to accept compliments. I think that's really helpful. To notice your fear of abandonment and rejection. I think that's incredibly helpful to start noticing those. Noticing what media you're taking in, or what advice, or what you're surrounded by. If you're watching a lot of YouTube videos, reading a lot of articles, are you reading stuff that's a lot of doom and gloom? Are you inundated with mental health stuff that's only making you believe? Are you using the internet as WebMD and constantly telling yourself that you're sick and broken? What beliefs are you reinforcing about yourself? I think that's incredibly important to pay attention to. And to notice shame. And are you getting help? Because if you've resonated with basically this entire podcast and or aspects of it, you're going to need some help. And I mean, like, professional support by people who are at the leading edge of this. I think Tim Fletcher represents that. It's not me. I can help give direction as to whether or not I help with maybe some of the diagnostic stuff, like trying to understand what's going on, maybe get some clarity of the patterns underneath, maybe helping you see something. Like, I can help with the awareness part. I can ask very good questions to get you there. Or I can help with the personality type stuff. If you really are trying to move forward from, I create this distinction between mental illness, mental health, and mental wellness, where mental illness is like the clinical stuff, where you need actual psychiatric clinical support. Mental health is diagnostic, it's maintenance, it's checking in with people, and co-accountability. And then you've got mental wellness, which is doing the everyday thing to meet your 12 needs. Tim Fletcher talks about the 12 needs, but doing everything you can to improve your life and circumstance, taking care of your body, your physicality, your relationships, being creative, resting, spiritual wholeness, pleasure, rewards for yourself, healthy rewards, and breaking habits of addictive behaviors, things like that. It's taking charge of your life, even if that means going towards clinical stuff for some of the things, or getting help with addictions or whatever. Ultimately, if there's anything, if I left this podcast episode, and this was the last episode I ever made on this podcast, and I feel like I'm getting close to like figuring out that this is the thing and I need to move on. If there's any one thing that I can give, it's that ultimately it is your life. And you need to take control of it. You are not at the whim of anybody else. You have to set a boundary. You have to get the help. You have to let some people go. You need to stop helping some people. You need to stop getting your hands in the pie all the time. You need to back away. You need to stop inundating your mind with violence and sexual explicitness and all of these things that you think are just fine and don't affect you. They may very well be affecting you. Well, they do affect you. You just may not be registering it. It impacts us to see or hear news stories all the time, to hear about the world's happenings. And don't be ignorant, but you don't need every single detail. And to be paying attention to what is your belief versus what are beliefs that you're borrowing from other people. That's the path of individuation. Individuating is ultimately seeing that I am me. And it's really accepting that the ego has a role. The ego is not in the lead. We have other different worldviews that allow for us to get much more nuanced grasp on reality. We have second person perspective where we relate with others and we have friends. Third person perspective where we're being a professional and we're being a citizen and we're conducting ourselves appropriately. And then we have fourth person perspective where we recognize that there are different cultures. There's a bigger world at large that we are a part of and contributing to in our own small way, and understanding that there are systems effects to the little things that we do. Like with understanding this narcissism and victim relationship, we are ultimately understanding that we are having an impact on, if we focus on healing ourselves through getting help and through eventually being of service, and in a lot of ways, letting go of ourselves, like I said, getting our own head out of our own ass and finding ways to be of service, not to take on the rescuer role, but to be, our own version of what it means to be a coach or a challenger or a creator. If we go down those roads, then we are having an impact on the generations ahead of us. Whether that's us having literally children and treating them better, but also showing people that we come across that there is such a thing as a healthy husband. There is such a thing as a healthy wife or a healthy partner or someone who healed from this. It gives people hope. It gives people a sense that there is a future where this technology, this awareness of complex trauma can be something that we can heal sooner, that we don't have to wait until midlife for someone to learn about this and to get some support. We can help people sooner. We can help people get past addictions and realize that it's about meeting and connecting to one of those 12 needs. And it's a little skewed. Or we can teach the 12 needs to kids when they're younger. Or we can spot narcissism much more freely. And ultimately, I think that's what's happening with a lot of women. They're trying to spot narcissism. And we just need to make it gender neutral and not make it a part of a narrative, a demonizing narrative. Boundaries, yes. Not enabling, yes. but also deserving of compassion, also deserving of healing, and also deserving of a better way and a better life, just as you are, just as I am. So accept a compliment. Ask your partner what they love about you and believe them. Show some love and affection to someone else. Get your head out of your ass. Stop listening to sad, sappy music. Stop watching violent TV. Let go. Find a path forward. Make dinner for your partner. Do something to be of service and allow yourself to participate in reality as you to slowly release into the sensitivity of your being, right? To be sensitive is to increase your senses. So it increases your ability to be emotionally aware, to be intellectually aware, to be physically aware, and to be socially aware. And the greater sensitivity you have, it actually creates malleability. It creates adaptability. It's not survival of the fittest in terms of strength. It's not survival of the most rigid. It's survival of the most adaptable. And at this point, you, like I, have probably been surviving. So you're good at surviving, but you're good at the perceived surviving of camouflaging and being rigid. I'm talking about surviving in the thriving way, where you get to be adaptable. You get to be dynamic. You get to be ultimately liberated from the whims of others. And you get to actually connect with others. You get to have real relationships, real bonds, real love, real interactions, and real genuine appreciation for what you bring uniquely to this world. My name is Christian Rivera. This has been Dopamine, dopamine.substack.com. And you can follow me at substack.com/dopamine, or no, /let's go C note, substack.com/let's go C note. Follow me there, and then also look at my other publications. I've got things around INTP specifically, the Developmental Digest, and I'm starting a new YouTube channel called Digital Dad, where I want to be of support to parents and young kids that are dealing with things like screen time and how do we find video games that are interesting and dynamic and full of story and artistic and not just YouTube shorts and TikToks and brains going faster and faster, but how do we find things to immerse and rest into that support a healthy developing brain. So that's youtube.com/adidigitaldad. You can find that there. And then again, substack.com/let's go C note to follow me and further podcast episodes. So let me know what you think. I appreciate you very much for listening. And again, if you need support from me, either in personality profiling or some sort of coaching support, diagnostic criteria, or just to try to give you some direction of where to go next, who to talk to, what kind of therapist you need, or if you need a therapist, that sort of stuff, feel free to reach out to me. So I appreciate you. Have a wonderful day, and I'll talk to you next time on Dopamine. See ya.